For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's nightly companion. He was the undisputed king of late night who tucked the nation into bed with a smile. He was a television icon who seemed to have it all: the wit, the charm, the power, and the adoration of millions who didn't just see him as a star, but as a friend. His stage felt like a living room, and his guests were the most famous people in the world. Yet he made it all seem impossibly comfortable, like a conversation you were part of. But when the cameras stopped rolling, the laughter faded. A quiet, profound loneliness took its place. The man who was a guest in millions of homes every night would spend his final years in near-total isolation, battling a secret illness that would tragically cut his life short. This is the story of the Johnny Carson the public never knew, and the heartbreaking reality of his final days. This is the story of how a man who lived in the brightest of spotlights chose to spend his end in the quietest of shadows. Haunted by personal tragedy and a body that was failing him, you can't really understand the tragedy of Johnny Carson's end without grasping the sheer magnitude of his reign. From October 1st, 1962 to May 22nd, 1992, Johnny Carson wasn't just the host of The Tonight Show. He was late-night television. He didn't just have a time slot. He owned the night. For millions of Americans, the day wasn't truly over until that familiar, swinging theme song played, and Ed McMahon's booming voice announced, "Here's Johnny." It was a national ritual, a shared comfort that cut across all walks of life. In a world that was getting more and more fragmented, Carson was the one thing everyone had in common. On screen, he was a master of his craft, a conductor of controlled chaos. His whole persona was a study in effortless grace. He had that Midwestern charm mixed with Hollywood sophistication, a man who could trade witty barbs with Don Rickles, be genuinely enchanted by a young actress, or listen with rapt attention to a scientist explaining the cosmos. He had an almost supernatural calm. While guests might be nervous or over the top, Johnny was the cool center, the anchor who made sure the ship, no matter how wild the waters got, would never capsize. His greatest gift was making it all look so easy. The monologue, which could skewer politicians from either party with a wry, even-handed wit, seemed like it was written on the breeze. His interviews felt less like interrogations and more like conversations you'd just happen to overhear at a fascinating dinner party. This on-screen ease translated into incredible power. In the world of Hollywood, an invitation to sit on Johnny's couch was the ultimate seal of approval. A successful appearance, one where a comedian made Johnny laugh and waved them over to the panel, could literally launch a career overnight. Jerry Seinfeld, David Letterman, Joan Rivers, Drew Carey, Roseanne Barr. The list of stars who got their big break on his show is a testament to his influence. He wasn't just a host, he was a kingmaker. His approval was a coronation. This power was reflected in his contract with NBC. In the 1980s, he was earning a reported $5 million a year, a staggering sum at the time, and had negotiated ownership of the show's tapes, a move of incredible foresight that made him one of the wealthiest men in entertainment. But it wasn't just his wit and power that people loved. It was the characters, the moments of pure, unscripted silliness that broke through that cool facade. You had Karnak, the magnificent, the all-knowing seer, in a ridiculous turban, who'd hold a sealed envelope to his forehead and divine the answer to a question nobody had asked. Answer: flypaper. Question: what do you use to gift wrap a zipper? The jokes were intentionally awful, but the joy was in watching Johnny struggle to keep a straight face as the audience howled. Then there was the doddering Aunt Blappy and the inept handyman Art Fern. These characters let him be goofy, to shed the persona of the suave host and just play. And who could forget the unscripted moments that became legendary? An animal expert would bring on some creature that would misbehave on his desk, and Johnny's reaction, a mix of panic and pure delight, was television gold. He shared in the joke, often making himself the butt of it, which only made the audience love him more. He was a steady and reassuring presence in American homes for 3 decades, a figure so reliable he felt less like a celebrity and more like a part of the family. His final show in 1992 drew an audience of an estimated 50 million people, a send-off reserved for royalty. They weren't just saying goodbye to a TV show, they were saying goodbye to an era. This was the public, Johnny Carson, the pinnacle of success, the master of his domain, a man beloved by a nation. And it was a persona so powerful and so complete that almost no one could see the deep, troubling cracks forming just beneath the surface, away from the cameras. When the bright lights went dark, Johnny Carson's life told a completely different story. The confident, outgoing man who commanded a nightly audience of millions was, in reality, a deeply private, shy, and often described as cold and aloof individual. His longtime friend and sidekick Ed McMahon famously quipped that Johnny was great with 10 million people, lousy with 10. This wasn't just a clever line, it was the fundamental paradox of Johnny Carson. He thrived in the artificial intimacy of a television studio but struggled with real connection when the red light went off. He was a man who needed an audience to feel comfortable, yet he kept those closest to him at a distance, according to his biographers and friends. A lot of this traced back to a difficult and emotionally starved childhood in Norfolk, Nebraska. The central figure in this early drama was his mother, Ruth Carson. Described as overbearing and nearly impossible to please, Ruth cast a long, cold shadow over Johnny's entire life. Biographer Lawrence Lima wrote that Ruth ran the household like the captain of a warship, leaving her children constantly fighting for a scrap of affection that almost never came. No matter how high her son rose, no matter the awards or the fame, nothing seemed to impress her. After Johnny sent his parents on a lavish trip to Europe, he called to ask what their favorite part was. His mother's reply was curt, "It's good to be home." When she died, Carson reportedly didn't go to her funeral and quipped to friends, "The Wicked Witch is dead." This lifelong quest for his mother's approval was the engine for his ambition, a desperate need for validation that millions of cheering strangers could give him, but his own mother never would. This emotional chill bled into his personal life. He was married 4 times, with 3 ending in bitter and expensive divorces. While he was a master of conversation on TV, he was often emotionally unavailable at home. He was a remote father to his 3 sons, Christopher, Corey, and Richard. His focus was always his career, because, as one of his ex-wives, Joanne, said, instinctively, he knew the career would never let him down. His relationships were often messy, a stark contrast to the controlled, polished world he lived in on television. He was known to have a temper and could be prone to heavy drinking, personal demons he wrestled with, far from the public eye. He was, as his own lawyer once bluntly put it, a deeply unhappy man. And then there was the habit, his constant companion through the stress and the loneliness, the cigarettes. For much of his career, smoking was part of his on-air persona. In the early years of The Tonight Show, a sterling silver box of Pall Malls sat on his desk, and he'd often light one up during the show, the smoke curling into the studio lights. It was a different time, but his habit was voracious. By the mid-1970s, he was reportedly smoking up to 4 packs a day. He knew it was dangerous, reportedly telling friends, "These things are killing me." It was a slow-motion act of self-destruction, a public habit that would have deeply private and devastating consequences. This was the hidden struggle of Johnny Carson. He was a man divided. On one hand, the king of late night, an American icon. On the other, a shy, insecure man, haunted by a cold upbringing and tethered to a habit that was quietly poisoning him from the inside out. He wasn't always a laughing boy, as he put it, when the cameras were off. For decades, he managed to keep these 2 worlds separate. But a series of devastating blows would soon begin to break down those carefully constructed walls, revealing the tragic figure within. For a man who had built a fortress around his private life, the first real crack in the wall came on June 21, 1991. It was a tragedy so profound, it would change the course of his life and career forever. His middle son, 39-year-old Richard "Rick" Carson, was killed in a car accident. Rick had been driving along a remote service road near California's Pacific Coast Highway when his car plunged down a 125-foot embankment. He'd been taking photographs, a passion of his, when he apparently made an unsafe turn, simple mistake, with the most final of consequences. The news shattered Johnny's carefully controlled world. This wasn't a bad review or a messy divorce. This was an absolute, irreversible loss. Rick had a complicated life. He had struggled with his mental health, and had, at times, a strained relationship with his famous father. Being Johnny Carson's son carried an immense weight. But this tragedy went beyond all of that. It was the loss of a child, a pain that no amount of fame could numb. Those close to Carson said they'd never seen him so broken. The man who had gone on air night after night through his own personal turmoil was completely undone. He took 4 weeks off from The Tonight Show, an unprecedented break for him. Even in his grief, though, Carson's instinct for privacy took over. He reportedly chose not to attend Rick's funeral, afraid his presence would turn the solemn occasion into a media circusa final, heartbreaking act of a father trying to protect his son, even in death. When he finally returned to the air, the nation saw a side of Johnny Carson they had never seen before. At the end of his show, he set aside the jokes. In their place was just a father, his voice thick with emotion, his usual composure gone. When Rick was around, he wanted to smile. He told the audience, his eyes welling up. He had a laugh that was contagious as could be. He tried so darn hard to please. He then shared a collection of the beautiful nature photographs his son had taken, including a stunning image of a sunset. It was a rare, deeply personal, and profoundly moving tribute. For a few minutes, the king of late night was gone, and in his place was a grieving father, sharing his son's art with the world. The loss of Rick was more than a personal tragedy. It was a turning point. His longtime bandleader, Doc Severinsen, later said that Johnny was never the same after Rick died. He lost the light in his eyes, Severinsen recalled, and never got it back. The joy that had driven him for 3 decades seemed to dim. The work, which had always been his escape, now felt different. The loss forced him to confront the deep regrets of his life. Less than a year after this devastating blow, Johnny Carson, still at the height of his popularity, would make a stunning announcement. He was walking away. The laughter was starting to fade, and the final, quiet chapter of his life was about to begin. On May 22, 1992, the curtain fell on an American institution. Johnny Carson, with Betty Midler and Robin Williams as his final guests, signed off from The Tonight Show for the last time. His farewell was heartfelt and humble. "I bid you a very heartfelt good night," he said, delivering his signature phantom golf swing to a standing, tearful ovation. An estimated 50 million people watched, bidding farewell to a man who had been a constant in their lives. The world waited to see what he would do next. Guest appearances, primetime specials. The answer was a resounding, and for many, a shocking, silence. Johnny Carson didn't just retire from television, he vanished from public life. He retreated into a self-imposed exile, becoming one of the most famous recluses in modern history. He turned down every request for an interview, every offer for a tribute, every invitation to appear on stage. It was as if the man who had lived in the nation's living rooms for 30 years had locked his own door and thrown away the key. His world shrank to a stunning cliff-top estate in Malibu and the deck of his magnificent 130-foot yacht, the Serengeti. His days were filled with quiet routines. He played tennis, he sailed, he read, and he spent time with his fourth wife, Alexis Mass, and a very small circle of trusted friends. He'd always been a private man, but this was a deliberate and complete withdrawal. Why? The reasons were complex. For one, he was fiercely protective of his legacy. He had left at the absolute top, and he had no interest in becoming a nostalgia act, a ghost of his former self trotted out for anniversary shows. He'd done the job perfectly for 30 years, and when he said it was over, he meant it. He also felt the show wasn't his anymore. He had passed the torch to Jay Leno, and he respected that transition by making a clean break. But there was a deeper, more personal reason. The isolation he had long preferred had now become permanent. The death of his son Rick had hollowed something out of him, and the demands of public life no longer held any appeal. He had spent a lifetime building emotional walls, and in retirement, he simply made them thicker. He wasn't entirely disconnected though. In a quiet act of creative generosity, he would occasionally write jokes and send them to David Letterman, the man many considered his true successor. Letterman would deliver the jokes in his monologue, a secret collaboration between the retired king and the new prince of late night. It was a small way for Carson to keep his brilliant comedic mind sharp, a connection to the world he had left behind, but on his own fiercely private terms. For over a decade, this was his life, a quiet existence of immense wealth and profound seclusion. He had found the privacy he always craved, but it came at the cost of being almost completely alone. It was a peaceful period, but it was also the calm before the final storm. For years after he retired, Johnny Carson seemed to be the picture of health for a man in his 70s. But the decades of chain-smoking, that 4-pack-a-day habit, had been a ticking clock. In March 1999, the alarm went off. At age 73, Carson suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital for emergency quadruple bypass surgery to save his life. The news was a shock. It was the first undeniable sign of mortality from the seemingly invincible TV icon. The surgery was a success, but it was a clear warning, and it was soon followed by an even worse diagnosis. Around 2002, doctors confirmed what many had long feared. Johnny Carson had emphysema. It's a cruel, chronic lung disease that slowly robs you of your ability to breathe. For a man whose voice, timing, and breath control were the very tools of his trade, it was a particularly devastating sentence. The disease is incurable, its progression a one-way street, and it's almost always linked to a long history of smoking. The cigarettes he had held so casually under the studio lights had finally come to collect their debt. True to form, Carson met this news with his usual stoicism and a tight grip on his own story. In 2002, after tabloids started reporting on his declining health, he issued a rare public statement. A spokesman confirmed the diagnosis, but immediately downplayed it. "I'm dealing with it the best I can," the statement read, "and it is not causing me any major problems." The message was clear. Nothing to see here. He insisted he was still in great shape. It was a classic Carson performance cool, controlled, and dismissing any hint of vulnerability. He was going to face this final battle on his own terms. But behind that defiant statement, the reality was grim. Emphysema is a relentless disease. It slowly shrinks your world. The tennis matches became less frequent, then impossible. Long trips on his beloved yacht became too difficult. The simple act of walking, of talking, of laughing, requires a conscious effort for a breath that never feels deep enough. A friend who played tennis with him for years noted that toward the end, his breathing became increasingly difficult. The heart attack was a sudden assault. The emphysema was a slow, quiet siege. Together, they marked the beginning of the end. The man who had once seemed so full of life was now in a quiet, desperate battle with his own body. His immense fortune could buy him the best medical care in the world, but it couldn't buy him a new set of lungs. It couldn't undo a lifetime of damage. The king, in his secluded castle by the sea, was slowly fading away. The last few years of Johnny Carson's life, from 2003 until his death in early 2005, were a time of profound and deepening quiet. The defiant front he had put up slowly crumbled under the physical reality of his illness. His world, once as vast as a national television audience, had shrunk to the walls of his Malibu home. The emphysema was no longer a manageable condition. It was a thief, stealing his breath, his energy, and the simple joys of his retirement. The tennis court sat empty. The grand voyages on the Serengeti were a thing of the past. His life became a series of small, calculated movements, each one dictated by the capacity of his failing lungs. Friends who visited him in this period described a man who was still mentally sharp, his wit as dry as ever, but physically frail. He was trapped in a body that could no longer keep up with his mind. For a man who had always been in absolute control, this creeping dependency must have been a private, daily hell. He was surrounded by staggering wealth and breathtaking beauty, panoramic views of the Pacific, the art, the comfort, but it was a gilded cage. He was isolated not just by choice, but by necessity. He spent his days reading, watching old films, and reflecting on a life of dizzying public highs and cavernous private lows. It was in this final quiet period that the full weight of his loneliness seemed to settle. The friends he had pushed away, the family connections that were strained, these were the ghosts that populated his silent house by the sea. His wife, Alexis, was his constant companion, the final gatekeeper of his fiercely guarded privacy. But even she couldn't shield him from the inevitable. As 2004 turned into 2005, his decline sped up. His breathing became more and more labored. The fight was ending on January 23, 2005. At the age of 79, Johnny Carson died peacefully at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause of death was respiratory failure due to emphysema. The man who had lived by his voice and breath was ultimately silenced by a lack of it. It wasn't a sudden, shocking end, but the quiet, tragic conclusion to a long, slow surrender. In death, as in his final years, Johnny Carson demanded privacy. In accordance with his wishes, there was no public funeral, no grand memorial service. His body was cremated, and his ashes were given to his wife, Alexis. It was the final act of a man who had separated his public persona from his private self, so completely that he wanted no public mourning for the man the world thought it knew. He left the stage as quietly as he had lived for the last 13 years of his life, but the world did not stay silent. News of his death prompted a massive, heartfelt outpouring of grief. Tributes poured in from every corner of the entertainment industry and from millions of ordinary Americans who felt like they had lost a friend. David Letterman, a man Carson had personally mentored, summed it up best: "All of us who came after are pretenders. We will not see the likes of him again." Jay Leno, his successor on The Tonight Show, called him the gold standard. Flowers piled up on his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for a man who died in near total seclusion. The public reaction was a deafening roar of affection. This is the ultimate paradox of Johnny Carson. His legacy is one of unparalleled influence, of a comedic genius who set the template for late-night television that still endures. He launched countless careers, defined a genre, and became a beloved nightly fixture in American culture for 30 years. His work is still celebrated, with clips from his show still getting laughs decades later. Yet, this monumental public legacy stands in stark, heartbreaking contrast to the quiet loneliness of his final years. The man who brought so much laughter into the world was himself a figure of deep, personal melancholy. The host who exuded such warmth and effortless connection was, in reality, a shy and remote man who struggled with intimacy his entire life. The tragedy of Johnny Carson isn't just that he died from a debilitating illness, but that a man so universally loved could feel so profoundly alone. His laughter echoed through generations, a sound that will likely never fade. But it's the silence of his final chapter that tells the most human and the most heartbreaking story of all. If you found this look into the life of a legend compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. What is your favorite memory of Johnny Carson? Let us know in the comments below. Johnny Carson invited America into his world every night. Yet in the end, very few were invited into his pet. His incredible success was built on a connection with an audience he couldn't replicate in his own life. He was a master of the public square and a ghost in his own home. He left behind a legacy of laughter that will echo for eternity, a gift to the millions of strangers he treated like friends, even as he spent his final days in a quiet, solitary world of his own making. 0